Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Dawson, the Policy and Program Specialist at NAST, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled The Death Master File, Understanding Its Role in Identifying Unclaimed Property. I hope everyone's doing well, and I want to thank you all out there for tuning in this afternoon. Before we begin, there's a few administrative tasks that I need to cover. In the handouts section of your console, you can download a copy of the slide deck being used today, as well as the speaker bio for our very experienced Charles Hellman. We encourage you to interact with us today by typing your questions into the box in the questions section at any time during the presentation, and our moderator, David Milby, will present these questions at the end of the formal presentation. So let's run a quick test. Make sure you can hear us and you understand where to submit your questions. So please type into the questions box whether we are coming through clearly. All right, looks like we are coming through, so thank you all for that. Once again, we encourage you to use that function throughout as questions arise. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NAST and NAPA sites. We have the webinar scheduled for an hour and a lot of great content to get through, so without any further ado, on behalf of NAST and the National Association of Unclaimed Property Administrators, I'd like to welcome and thank our valued corporate affiliate partner, Verus, for presenting to our membership today and to our attendees for joining us. At this point, Charles, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you everybody for taking the time out this afternoon to participate in this webinar. As Jeremy said, I'm Charles Hellman. I'm Executive Vice President with Verus Analytics. We provide third-party auditing services to 47 states. And today we are going to be talking about the somewhat ominously sounding but accurately named Death Master File. Based on the name, sounds a little bit like it should be something that somebody in a gray uniform hands to Darth Vader. But in fact, it is a database maintained by the Social Security Administration. I'm going to be talking today a bit about its history of the Death Master File, how it's been used, particularly talking about how it's being used in unclaimed property, some changes that have been made to the Death Master File, and how it's being addressed in current unclaimed property legislation. I understand that the participants on today have a broad range of experience with the Death Master File, but hopefully for those of you that haven't had occasion to have much interaction with this, that this will give you a pretty good idea of what it is. And for those of you who have a fair amount of experience with it, hopefully it will touch on a few things that maybe you weren't aware of, or things to possibly be aware of going forward. After I get done, we'll hopefully have some time at the end for any questions that anybody has, and I guess with that, I will get started. So as I indicated, the DMF, as it's commonly known, it's a database that's maintained by the Social Security Administration that's been compiled since around 1962, listing deaths of individuals in the United States. This is the major limitation. It's deaths in the United States for people with Social Security numbers. The DMF is a subset of the Social Security Administration's larger NUMIDENT or NUMIDENT, I'm not sure how they pronounce it, but the database file that they track of all sorts of information related to Social Security number holders that have been issued back to the beginning in 1936. And this includes a broad range of information of names and places of birth, dates of birth, etc. So you've got full names at birth, as well as changes in names, address information, and death information is the DMF portion of this, which the Social Security Administration is able to use this to administer their program. So all of this information is important. Death information, as you can imagine, is particularly important in order to cut off payments for people that are due payments while they're alive, or to start payments that may be due to beneficiaries or changes to payments. And so the DMF has been an important tool to the SSA for decades, going back into the mid 20th century or before. Over time, it's become more modernized with technology. And for purposes of today's presentation, It's important to a lot of users outside of the DMF, outside of the Social Security Administration, as it's been made available publicly since 1980. It became public as a result of a few things that took place. It began with a FOIA request that was made to the Social Security Administration back in 1978 by a gentleman named Ronald Perholtz. His FOIA request was denied. He was asking for this death information. It was denied. He brought a lawsuit. The Department of Justice looked at this and said that there was no privacy interest in dead people to this information, and so it should be disclosed. They settled it pursuant to a consent decree in 1980, and after that, they started to receive more requests for it, and at some point soon after, the Social Security Administration decided that the best way to deal with this was, rather than waiting for requests, was to make this public. And over time, that became more done in a more organized fashion. And so since 1992, the DMF has been available to the public through the United States Department of Commerce's National Technical Information Service, which is a clearinghouse for a number of different data sources that the federal government maintains. The DMF, there's different ways that you can subscribe to it from NTIS. You can actually receive the full data in a download, the raw data that gets downloaded to you, and then you get physical discs of that, and then you get monthly updates. And then there's also an ability to subscribe to it from NTIS, where you get online access to do searching. And its cost is relatively minimal. I don't have the actual numbers in front of me now, but my recollection is that it's in the thousands of dollars to actually get a full download of the DMF, and monthly subscriptions, that you're required to do if you're going to access that, is several $1,000s a year. So it's cost efficient. NTIS charges it based upon recovering the cost of administering the program. But as we're going to talk about a little bit further on, most users, most entities that access DMF information get it not directly from NTIS, but get it from some third-party source that incorporates it. So as of 2006, the DMF had in excess of 100 million individual records of death. But to complicate this story a little bit, I got to talk about the difference between the full DMF and the public DMF, which will become more important as we talk about some of the changes to the DMF in the past few years. So the full DMF includes all death information that gets reported to the Social Security Administration, which includes, since 1983, the Social Security Administration, the Social Security Act was amended to require the Social Security Administration to collect death information from states pursuant to contracts that the administration enters into with states to provide this information. That information that gets provided by the states only to the Social Security Administration is exempt from public disclosure on the DMF, on the publicly available DMF that I was just describing to you before, that's been available since 1980. Up until recently, that has not made that big of a difference up until around 2011, that the number of deaths on the public DMF and the full DMF were not that different, and that the DMF was pretty comprehensive in its reporting of deaths that occur every year in the United States. We'll get back to that later in the webinar, but just so that you understand, because it will come up as I'm talking further, there's the public DMF and there's the full DMF, and they are not the same. But in terms of its accuracy, whether we're talking about the public DMF or the full DMF, it's shown to be extremely accurate, and it's continuously monitored by government agencies looking at various sources of errors or ways to improve it. And so I just want to read to you some testimony from a 2008 statement by the then Deputy Commissioner of Commissioner of Systems of the Social Security Administration. And in his testimony, he says, the death data that we maintain is 99.5% accurate overall. As with any process, There are occasional errors, but to the best of our knowledge, no case of fraud or abuse has occurred as a result of errors to the death master file. That statistic, 99.5% accurate, it's from everything I've seen, this goes back to 2008, but that's around the numbers that keep showing up in various reports. And the second part of what I read to you about that to the SSA's knowledge, no case of fraud or abuse has occurred as a result of errors in the DMF is, I think, particularly important, because what that is indicating is that the DMF is not a place that people go to try and get wrong information entered about a death so that they can somehow use that for a fraudulent purpose to collect on something or to do something that establishing somebody as dead, will be to their benefit. In contrast to death certificates, where there is a fair amount of fraud or things can be used to abuse the system, the DMF is not the best way to go about doing that, for the reason that I just mentioned, that it's continuously monitored for accuracy and errors. So if you're trying to get yourself listed on the DMF and you're alive, that's not the easiest way to do it. That being said, some of you may have heard or seen articles talking about the problem of people who are deceased being listed on the DMF, which is a problem for someone, as you might imagine, that you don't want to be on there if you're alive. You may not want to be on there at all, but eventually, I guess that's a different webinar. But the number of people that actually are living who are mistakenly included on the DMF is an extremely small number. And that I just wanted to talk about a couple of other reports about from the Social Security Administration. So this is from a 2009 report by the Inspector General, which looked at about 3.4 million records that were added to the DMF over an 18-month period between April of 2007 and October of 2008. And in doing so, they found that there were about 7,600 deaths that were shown to have been mistakenly added, potentially for people who were alive. That's not confirmed that they all were, but that's largely the problem, that there were around 7,597 deaths out of 3.4 million added during this period. That is an error rate of less than 1/4%. So it puts the DMF accuracy rate at around 99.75%. That study, a similar study, was done in 2015, which came to a similar result. It found that there were fewer than 1,000 cases a month of people who were living who were added to the DMF. So that would be about 12,000 a year. That puts you at the number of deaths that are added to the DMF. It's about a 0.48% error rate. So you have, again, 99.5% accuracy, and significantly, those people are generally very quickly taken off. Not to undermine this as a problem for the individuals who are listed, it can, as the SSA has acknowledged, that this is a significant problem that they want to make sure it doesn't happen, and then when it does, it's addressed. And that is, I think, that it is the case that it is addressed. The reason for that is because, as a practical matter, it's very difficult to operate unless you're operating completely off the grid if you're on the DMF. In addition to the problem of if you had benefits from the Social Security Administration that could have been cut off, you also can't open a bank account. You can't really do anything of a financial nature if you're listed as dead. And we're going to talk about why that is, because it's used to make sure that dead people's Social Security information isn't being used to open up accounts. But again, they are taken off, relatively quickly. And most important for today's webinar, from an unclaimed property perspective, when you get to the point that you might be identifying unclaimed property through use of the DMF, it's virtually impossible, if not completely impossible, that you're out 3 years or 5 years, which is the dormancy period, for most property types that would be of relevance here. To be 3 years out from the date of death according to the DMF and be listed on the DMF, it's really To the extent it's happened, it's somebody who is living in the woods, and not really engaged in any sort of modern activity. So again, this is something that you will occasionally, it makes for a good news story to talk about, somebody who was surprised to see that they were dead when they weren't. But it is not, for purposes of unclaimed property, something that is a problem. So as a result, as I was saying, before about the use of the DMF has become a leading resource for identifying and confirming deaths in the United States for a lot of different purposes. So I'd like to talk a little bit about those purposes and how the DMF is accessed. So I mentioned earlier that it's available directly from NTIS or through various commercial databases that incorporate the DMF. It's an important tool that is used by a lot of different users. You've got healthcare researchers and genealogists. So you've got healthcare researchers using it to determine medical study participant survival rates, monitor, discharge outcomes for patients from the hospital, genealogists using it to identify people, when they died, et cetera. More relevant to our purposes here, it's also been used by a lot of different financial institutions that check the DMF before opening accounts to prevent fraud and identity theft. It's used for anti-money laundering purposes, anti-terrorist activity, underwriting of insurance policies so that you're not issuing a policy to somebody who's already dead. So it's been a standard to prevent fraud and to check on the life status of somebody before engaging in financial activities with it. It's been used in particular in life contingent situations where you're making payments to somebody based upon them reaching an age and being alive. So in an annuity context or a pension context, the DMF has long been used, after payments start, to check to make sure that their person isn't deceased. If you see that they're deceased on the DMF, stopping the payments to make sure that families aren't receiving money that then becomes difficult to recover if mistaken payments go out, or just missing it and just continuing to make payments for extended periods of time. As a result of its prevalence, as I was talking about before, the DMF is incorporated into a lot of other services that don't necessarily, people using it aren't being told immediately that this is DMF information. So Accurate for Insurance, offered by Lexis, incorporates the DMF. Until recently, as security concerns increased in general, there used to be a website, rootsweb.com, that just listed, it was a publicly available free version of the DMF. You could go right, anybody who had a computer screen and an internet connection could open it up and they would get access to the DMF and could do searching. And so it was incorporated into a lot of practices of a lot of different companies for a lot of different purposes. Governmental entities have long used it outside of the Social Security Administration. State agencies have used it to check the DMF to prevent improper payments to deceased individuals of various government benefits. Government pensions use it to make sure that they're not continuing to make payments to deceased individuals, just like private issuers of new annuity and annuity products. The U.S. Treasury maintains a do not pay portal to protect and prevent improper payments, and one source that is included on that portal is the DMF. It's been used, if not directly, indirectly, often to locate missing customers. So a company that doesn't sends out a piece of mail to a customer, gets it back as returned undeliverable, goes to search on, again, just using Accurate as an example, to see if they could find a better address for that person. Accurate, that search will include checking against the DMF, and the company may get back a listing that says this person is dead. They'll get a D next to their name, and then that is based upon a DMF listing. So it's been prevalent in that use as well. And the most salient purposes for today. It's also become increasingly used by state auditors and holders to identify unclaimed property over the past decade on an increasingly frequent basis. So let's focus on that for a couple minutes. The DMF can be used to lead to a determination that somebody's property that a company is holding on to should be considered dormant, because if you're deceased, there's a significant likelihood, depending upon the property type, that you're no longer in touch with it. There isn't a beneficiary or somebody who is aware of it hasn't made a claim. That's been particularly a powerful tool that's been used in identifying unclaimed death benefits under life insurance policies, annuity contracts, as well as retained asset accounts. And for those of you who aren't familiar with retained asset accounts, those are accounts that are set up by insurance companies to fund life insurance benefits, so that instead of getting a payout directly, you put the money into a retained asset account that's held by the insurance company. Oftentimes you have retained asset accounts that are issued to beneficiaries of a spouse who died, who themselves are elderly, who then die within a year or two without telling anybody about the retained asset account, and the money sits there as well. So all three of these areas have been used. The DMF has been used to identify unclaimed property in all three of these areas. And it's particularly the case because of the nature of the product. We're talking about a product, life insurance policy, that is payable upon death. And if you took out a policy, when you were young and stopped paying on it years ago and didn't tell anybody, it's possible that at the time that you die, that your beneficiaries aren't aware of it and nobody makes a claim and it sits with the insurance companies. This is the case even though DMF has been something that insurance companies have used for a long time, as we've talked about, as I talked about before, using it to stop payments on annuities and anti-fraud purposes. But most cases, not all cases, insurance companies had not utilized it for the purpose of identifying deceased insured so you could begin the payout process. As I mentioned also before, you've got the use by companies, including insurance companies, to look for new addresses for missing customers. That also has often could have resulted in the company getting notice of death, which they would use to stop sending mail, but they might not have been using it to initiate a claims process. As a result of these issues over the course of decades, a significant amount of unclaimed death benefits built up, benefits that went unpaid to the beneficiaries and unreported as unclaimed property to the states, for many years after the insured has died. So Verus Analytics has been dealing in this area for a significant number of years, so since 2008, and I think that we were really the first third-party auditors were retained state unclaimed property third-party auditors retained by states to conduct unclaimed property examinations have utilized the DMF to identify unclaimed life insurance proceeds that should have been paid out to beneficiaries or remitted to the states. That is an area where I think its use has become well developed and recognized. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's also being used in a lot of other areas beyond life insurance. So it can be used really, in virtually any account type situation. You have bank accounts, you have brokerage accounts, where you have a deceased owner who's not in touch, who didn't have their property, didn't have their estate, is not aware of it. It could be sitting with a company. The DMF could be used to help identify that as unclaimed property. Same thing with CDs. You have a CD that's automatically rolling over. You have somebody who's died who owns it. Nobody is contacting the bank on that. DMF might also let you know that this person is no longer in touch with their property. As a result of its use, I think both its general usage as well as its use by states in the unclaimed and the insurance area, the DMF has become increasingly accepted as an important tool that can be used to identify unclaimed property. And starting with the insurance area, in addition to unclaimed property examinations, state insurance regulators have conducted market conduct examinations of a number of large insurance companies looking into this issue and have entered into regulatory settlement agreements with a significant percentage of the largest life insurance companies in the United States that requires the companies to perform their own ongoing DMF comparisons to identify potentially unclaimed life insurance benefits. The goal being that in addition to any past buildup of property unclaimed death benefits, that this shouldn't be going on in the future. And by having companies do their own comparisons, you have a higher chance of finding the beneficiary, paying them, or if not, eventually turning it over as unclaimed property. These exams, both the unclaimed property exams as well as the insurance exams, led to the National Conference of Insurance Regulators legislatures to adopt a model Unclaimed Life Insurance Benefit Act, which built into it a requirement to conduct DMF searches to identify potentially unclaimed death benefits. As of today, there are, I believe, 31 states that have enacted some form of the NCOIL Model Act requiring DMF comparisons. There are variations amongst the states that have adopted this as to what is the scope of coverage and therefore what's the effectiveness of the statute. So you've got about 12 states that apply the act mostly to new policies only. Some of them have an exception depending upon the conduct of the insurer, where it might cover some policies that lapsed in the past before the searches were conducted. But so 12 states that limit their acts to new policies or policies that were not in existence as of the date that the Model Act, the act was put into effect, only apply to policies issued after that date. You've got 19 states that apply it to enforce policies, all policies enforced as of the date of enactment, and 4 of those states at least include at least some policies that had lapsed sometime prior to the enactment. And so that's important in terms of its effectiveness because, the problem generally is older policies that have been sitting around, particularly policies where the records, may not have been as good at the time. People might not have told their beneficiaries about them. That's really where the problem that most significant is existed is in older policies. Somebody who takes out a policy today is not likely to die in the next few years, or if they do die, it's more likely that their beneficiary will be aware of it, will make a claim on the policy. So, as I say, the effectiveness of some of these NCOIL acts really, depends upon what was enacted within that state. Beyond the regulatory settlement agreements and the statutes requiring DMF searching, a lot of insurance companies are incorporating this as a best business practice on their own, whether they're required to do it or not. They've just seen the change. They see it's in the best interest of their customers and are doing ongoing searches, that may go beyond what's required of them by a particular state statute. Outside of the insurance arena, DMF comparisons have been utilized in unclaimed property examinations of other types of companies, including banks and other financial service companies, and they've also been incorporated into unclaimed property resolution agreements to resolve some of those examinations where, again, looking at let's take a brokerage account for example, somebody has a brokerage account, there's no indication in the electronic files of the company that person's account has gone dormant, but you go and check and you see that the owner of that account died 7-8 years ago. There's no estate out there that's monitoring this. This is a potential indicator that account should be considered unclaimed, and you should be looking to pay somebody the proceeds of it or turn it over as unclaimed property. Additionally, you've got a lot of third-party service providers that are helping companies comply with their unclaimed property obligations in a variety of different industries. And those companies are often incorporating DMF searching as part of their process to help companies comply with their unclaimed property obligations. I would also mention, it's not on the bullets here, but the SEC under Rule 17 AD 17 requires searches for lost security holders that should be conducted by transfer agents and broker-dealers. They're required to use at least one information database service to try and locate somebody who's missing. And those services, too, will often incorporate the DMF. So as part of that required searching under by the SEC, that companies are finding that security holders are deceased and their property should be considered unclaimed. So I'd like to transition a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the challenges in performing DMF comparisons, because obviously, if companies are doing it or auditors are doing it, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that achieves the best results. And there are a few things that can complicate that process. In particular, name commonality is a big problem. And so just jumping down to the second bullet, just in case it's not entirely clear here on the screen, if you look at the DMF, there are over 74,000 entries where the first and last name of the person is the exact same as at least 100 entries, so that you have at least 100 people with the same first and last name, and there can be a lot of entries that are significantly more. So if you look at James Smith, you'll find 22,000 entries on the DMF for James Smith and 20,000 entries for Mary Smith. So just on the name alone, you're not going to have too many people that have a single name combination, and you got to deal with that. And then adding to this complication is you've got data discrepancies where you have missing data or different data on a system that doesn't match up exactly with the DMF. And so you want to conduct your DMF comparisons in a way that doesn't result in excessive false positives, which are results where you're identifying somebody as being deceased when in fact they're not, or excessive false negatives, where you're overlooking people who are deceased, but the data may not match up exactly. And I'm going to just sort of give some illustrations in a minute of some of these types of data discrepancies that complicate this process. And adding to this, these complications is the fact that if you're talking about a large financial company or an insurance company that has not been monitoring their records for deaths, you're talking about looking at millions of data entries in order to figure out who may be deceased that has unclaimed property, and you're going to want the DMF comparisons to be done by somebody who has significant data capabilities and the technical resources and expertise to achieve the best results. Again, looking at this individually on a one-off basis, you could look at a record and compare it to the DMF and take these type of discrepancies into account. But when you're talking about large volumes, you got to do it in some sort of automated way and using algorithms to match the data. And fuzzy logic is the technology, or is the term that makes it possible to not only identify exact matches between records of a company and the DMF, but also partial matches that where there's a high likelihood that the person that you're looking at is deceased. Fuzzy logic, just to give a little background on that, because it's something that in the legislative process of looking at DMF searching, or in the audit process that you hear a lot from companies talking about, what is fuzzy logic? Its very name sort of sounds somewhat questionable, but it is a term of art. It dates back to the 1960s. It's attributed, at least from my readings, to a professor at the University of California. It's essentially, for lawyers who are on the webinar today may be familiar with Boolean searches, where you're searching on Lexis or Westlaw, and you're saying this word and this word. You want all your search results to bring up results that contain both of those words, and it's really a binary function where it's either a yes or a no. Fuzzy logic is taking into account that the answers are not always a yes or a no, that you might have a close to a match, but it's not an exact match. And so I think another, a form of fuzzy logic that I think is helpful is like a Google searching. When you search on Google and you don't have the exact spelling right, and then Google will tell you, did you mean this? It's a form of logic saying you got this almost right, but it's not right, and commonly this is how it's spelled. It's bringing you up those results to make sure that you're getting the best results. That is what fuzzy logic is. It's not as some companies that have been opposed to DMF searching have said, this is really something that they shouldn't have to look at. And it is something that a lot of the NCOIL model acts have built in, that have been passed by states have built into a greater or lesser extent requiring some sort of fuzzy logic in their matching process to make sure that companies aren't overlooking good matches. And so the expertise and experience of the entity in performing DMF matches is going to significantly impact the quality of the results. That's something we at Verus are very aware of and concerned about, because I can tell you in the audit context, that is something that we often hear from companies saying, hey, how do we know that you're going to be giving us good results and that we're not going to be looking at a lot of false matches? And we have been able to successfully show them that our results, are not going to do that. It's not in the state's interest any more than it is in the company's interest to be turning over property that belongs to people who are alive and saying that this is a product that is a property that's being turned over because the owner is dead. And so I'm going to now just quickly walk through, just to the extent it's helpful to see some of what are the types of fuzzy logic, how fuzzy logic can assist in this process. So looking at the screen at the top, where you're matching social security numbers, you can have transposed digits. So in this example, you have a social security number that's off by one digit in the middle. On the first example, so it's a 5 instead of a 6. That would be you could have an algorithm that would track for that. You've got in the second example just a 6 and a 7 have been reversed. So I mean, I think these are somewhat self-explanatory, but these hopefully give you a better sense of the type of things that fuzzy logic is able to do. The last one, just on there because it goes a little bit beyond fuzzy logic, is that you've got in this hypothetical, you've got somebody named Mary Cooper who's on the DMF with a social security number, and you match it to a company that doesn't have the social security number for that person, but the address, you're able to match the address of Mary Cooper to an address in the company's records. That may be a policy that you're able to look at, or a property that you're able to look at, and in the records you may be able to find that this is in fact the same person. Just again, this is just some more complete examples of some hypotheticals of how fuzzy matching can work. So in this top example, you've got an exact match on the date of birth. You've got a missing social security number in the holder's data. You've got a DMF social security number for that person, but you look at the first name, it's Antonio instead of Anthony, and one typo in the last name, Cavallini instead of Callini. Again, this is you can have your matching, identify these as potentially good matches, look at them closer to see if it is a match that should be considered the same person. And by looking at the electronic records of the company, if you go into other records, you may find additional information that'll confirm the match. Same thing on the bottom. This is just, again, this is a situation where you have the first name is an initial instead of the full name. The DMF data is actually missing the last name, and you've got a typo on the last name. I'm sorry, the DMF data is missing the last letter on the first name, and you've got a typo in the last name, a difference, a missing S, but the social security number is matching, the date of birth is matching, and the social security number has one digit off there. The 4 and the 3 at the end are reversed, and the 3 and the 4. So these are examples of fuzzy matching. You can get the results, you can look at them and decide whether these merit looking at closer, and they are the same person or not. So now I'm going to move on to the next topic here, which is what changes have been made recently to the DMF that potentially impact its use. So there's two changes that I'm going to talk about. The first is a reinterpretation by the Social Security Administration of what constitutes protected state death records. As I mentioned before, earlier, that under the Social Security Act, the SSA contracts with states, receives death information from the states. That death information, if it's the only source of the report, if that's the only source of the report, then it's not it's not supposed to be reported on the publicly available DMF. In 2011, the Social Security Administration reinterpreted its what constitutes protected death records and issued a statement that it was going to be removing approximately 4.2 million records that were added between 2002 and 2011 that should have been considered protected state death records and were removed. And additionally, said that going forward that it anticipated approximately a million fewer deaths would be added annually because of this new interpretation of what constituted state-reported death information. They did clarify, however, and this has always been the case, is that a death that gets reported to the Social Security Administration by a state and there is no other source of it and it hasn't been confirmed by the Social Security Administration, once it gets confirmed, gets verified by the Social Security Administration or gets reported from another source, it no longer is considered protected state death records. So even after this change, as death reports come in from other sources, they will no longer be considered exempt from disclosure on the publicly available Social Security Administration. So that's the first change. The second change I want to talk about is limited access DMF information, which is something that came about in 2014 in connection with the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. It amended the Social Security Act to restrict access to deaths for people who died 3 years ago or less. It's based on a concern that this information was being used potentially to engage in identity theft and fraud. It was particularly concerned was that people were filing tax returns for people who had died recently. There were several bills at the time before this was resolved through the Bipartisan Budget Act that were out there that would have restricted access to the DMF as a result of this concern. In particular, one of the bills was based upon an extremely sad story of a young girl who had died, and her parents went to file their tax return, and somebody else had gone in and gotten that tax return on behalf of their daughter. You know, it was an extremely distressing situation that led to this concern that eventually was resolved through the Bipartisan Budget Act. There was a rulemaking process put into place as to what should be limited, and what I think is significant in this process is, other than this problem that led to these bills of tax returns being, you know, falsely paid out to people who stole the identity of somebody who recently died, the bigger use for the DMF to prevent fraud was what was concerning almost everybody that participated in the rulemaking process, wanting to make sure that the DMF did not become so limited for these deaths that it couldn't be used to make sure that people weren't opening up accounts in the names of dead people or taking out insurance policies in the name of people who already died. But this was the compromise, that deaths would be limited for people for the first 3 years, but after 3 years have passed, deaths listed on the limited access DMF go back to being added to the public DMF. So what is the impact of these changes? Let's talk first about the limited access DMF. So from an unclaimed property perspective, because in almost all contexts, the dormancy period is going to be at least 3 years, and because limited access DMF information comes back around to being available after 3 years, it really has little, if any, impact on its use in identifying unclaimed property. There is some property that might have a 1-year dormancy period in some states. I think that's, again, it's pretty limited, particularly the property types that the DMF would be helpful in using to identify potentially unclaimed property. There are some additional requirements. I think I didn't go over this in detail, but the limited access DMF information, you still can get it if you have a permissible purpose, which is a legitimate fraud prevention interest or a legitimate business purpose pursuant to a governmental rule, regulation, or fiduciary duty. And Unclaimed property administration is a permissible purpose, but you do have to meet stringent security requirements. So states that want to have access to this information need to meet those requirements. But again, for purposes of unclaimed property, I think the limited access DMF has had little impact. The other change that we talked about, though, that the new definition of what constitute protected state data has a bigger impact for post-2010 deaths. Prior to that change, as I think I mentioned earlier, the DMF was extremely comprehensive. Generally, in excess of 90% of the number of deaths per year in the United States were added to the DMF. By 2009, 2010, it was actually over 99%. After this reinterpretation, you have a decrease of 40% or more in the number of deaths that are added to the public DMF each year. Going forward, it remains to be seen how many of these deaths will eventually be verified and therefore get added back to the public DMF. The reason why I say that it remains to be seen is because part of the reason for the reinterpretation, or I should say, I think the main reason, as far as I understand it, for the reinterpretation was changes in how deaths are being reported by the states. They are coming through now, instead of what used to be the most prevalent source was by funeral homes. They're coming in now through state-run electronic registries. Those are increasingly on the rise. At some point, that will level off. But because they're on the rise, we're not yet able to really see how many deaths get added back in after they're verified, because at the same time that's happening, potentially you're having more electronic state registry deaths being reported. So I think in the next few years, we'll have a better sense of what's going on there. At the same time that the DMF for the newer deaths is less complete, the older deaths are more complete. In 2018, the Social Security Administration added 8 million death records for older deaths. These are deaths going back to 1928. So it remains an extremely comprehensive source for deaths prior to 2011. Post 2011, it's important to conduct DMF searching in a way that supplements it with other available sources. In particular, I'd mention the National Association of Public Health Statistics and Information Services maintains access to death records. This is an organization that is comprised of the individual state vital statistic bureaus that maintain death records. They, as of 2017, had access to 40 states as well as a number of other jurisdictions that make this information accessible to somebody with a permissible purpose for a subscription fee. And they are continuing to grow their participation by the states. And their goal, I think, is to become a comprehensive death listing source similar to the DMF. In order to be able to obtain this information, you have to show that you have a valid need for the death data that falls within their categories, which are federal benefits, federal benefit administration, state and local benefits, state and local administration, pension, retirement, insurance receivables, or financial entities. So again, unclaimed property would be a permissible purpose in terms of complying by holders, and states in terms of making sure that that companies are complying. There are other databases as well that are publicly available that have access to this information, including obituary records and credit header information. So it's important for any entity that's performing death searches for newer deaths to supplement the DMF information with these type of resources. So the last area that I want to cover here is how the unclaimed property laws address the DMF. Until recently, there was no explicit mention of the DMF, which is, if you think about it, would make sense. Most of the DMF, until the recent revised Unclaimed Property Act, we're talking about a lot of states with an act that was based on the 1981 Uniform Act or an earlier act, or potentially the 95 Act. NAUPA and a number of states have taken the position that a DMF match should be considered evidence of that a property owner is deceased. NAUPA made submissions to the NCOIL process in 2014 when NCOIL was looking at their model act. It also made submissions to the Uniform Law Commission recommending inclusion of DMF matching requirements into the revised Uniform Unclaimed Property Act, some of which, not all of which, but some of which were included in the revised act as it was adopted in 2016. Specifically, RUPA, the revised Uniform Unclaimed Property Act, Section 2012, says that an insurer will be deemed to have knowledge of death not only as a result of a death certificate or identifying death in the course of due diligence, but also from a validated DMF match made by the insurer itself or by a state agent during an examination. So under the revised act, a DMF match can trigger an obligation of the insurer to locate the beneficiaries, attempt to pay them, and escheat their property if the beneficiary can't be located. Currently, the revised act has been introduced or enacted in 12 states, 5 of which have actually enacted it. 4 of those states include this definition. 7 of those states didn't get enacted during the legislative session, and so they have died, but the expectation is that more versions of RUPA will be added in the upcoming legislative sessions. Other specific states have gone further than the revised act in their own unclaimed property acts in terms of addressing how the DMF should be used and what a DMF match means. So Illinois adopted a version of RUPA in 2017 that made a number of changes. They specifically went beyond just saying a DMF match may be indication that the individual is dead, but they actually said that a DMF match, an insured or annuitant will be presumed dead based on a DMF match conducted by an insurer or an administrator during an audit, and that the presumption, in order to be rebutted, they have to have competent and substantial evidence that the insured person is living. Additionally, under Illinois insurance law, there's a requirement for insurers to search the DMF for policies back to 2000, and if the benefits can't be paid, they need to be reported as unclaimed property. And beyond the insurance context, the Illinois Act also expressly requires holders of retirement accounts and securities that receive an indication that an owner is deceased to take steps to try and confirm the death. The steps that are taken will likely involve searches that include the DMF. And RUPA also includes a provision explicitly stating that a deceased person can't indicate interest in his property. So under the Illinois Act, it's important for companies to be checking to make sure lost customers are not deceased. Florida also has had some more explicit DMF search requirements. They amended their unclaimed property law to require DMF matching by insurance companies on policies back to 1992. That aspect of the law, the retroactive aspect that applies it to policies back to 1992, is the subject of a case that was brought in Florida State Court. It is currently on appeal, and oral arguments are scheduled to be heard in January of 2019. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to quickly cover these last couple of slides. On the other end of the spectrum, there have been some proposals to limit DMF, the implications of a DMF match in unclaimed property legislation. So the ABA has an unclaimed property subcommittee that drafted its own model act. This has not been adopted by the ABA, but is continuing to be worked on. That model act provides that unless a state has enacted its own laws requiring DMF searching, an insurer has no obligation to confirm if an insured or annuitant is deceased, even if it's received notice of death. So it contrasts with the revised Unclaimed Property Act on its definition of knowledge of death made by a company or by a state auditor. So to wrap this up and still have a couple minutes for questions, I would conclude just to summarize by saying that the DMF remains the single largest comprehensive source of public death death listings in the United States. It's been increasingly recognized in a variety of contexts for how it can be used to identify unclaimed property. It should be, however, supplemented by other available sources for identifying more recent deaths. Comparisons that are conducted should be conducted in a manner to avoid false negatives and false positives. And I think states should be aware of what is happening in their state with proposed legislation that might either enhance or inhibit the ability of the states to utilize the DMF to identify unclaimed property. And so with that, I will turn this over in the last few minutes for any questions that anybody may have. David, are you with me?
Well, thanks, Charles. This is Jeremy. We have had a couple questions coming in from the audience here. So we'll start. Looks like Tammy asks, what is the basis for statements regarding the DMF's accuracy, as this seems to contradict the GAO report on its accuracy? Congressional testimony on the topic and the Institute for Legal Reform that were issued after the 2008 statement you read.
Without going through specific statements, I read from a 2009 report. I read from a 2015 report. So I can't address the specific statements that may be referred to by the question. But in general, again, depending upon the statistic that you're looking at, the number of people that are not deceased that are listed on the DMF has remained about the same at 99.5% accuracy. In general, the DMF, the GAO, and the Inspector General's office do continue to conduct searches, and I'm not, again, without looking at the report, I can't say what statistics that might be referred to that would contradict the statistics I read. And in general, I think that the DMF is shown to be, extremely reliable, and that the government's work, to the extent they do find mistakes and they work to fix them. But if it's the statistic on number of living people listed on the DMF, again, I gave you that. That's the 2015 study is examining federal improper payments and errors in the Death Master File.
Charles, this is David Milby. I have a question about the ABLE accounts, and I know that's something fairly new that the treasurers have been supporting, and then also other agencies, fiscal public finance agencies. This person would like to know, resources in 529A ABLE accounts are fairly new. The first accounts opened in June 2016, and we only have a handful of notices of deaths among ABLE account owners. So, we've got 29,707 accounts opened as of the end of September 2018. Is there a way to do a search for, and this is in quotes, ABLE account, ABLE, and or, again in quotes, 529A account, to survey, and I have to scroll down a little bit here, I apologize, to survey the numbers of individuals who have died who are ABLE account owners, or is the name and social security number required to do a search? Do you have any thoughts on this emerging issue?
I have to think about this, I think, a little bit more. I think, and I'd be happy to talk further with anyone about this. My initial thoughts are, you do need some identifying information in order to be performing searches. So just an account number or anything isn't going to give you an idea of that. If you do have a way of getting that information, there is, I'm sure, ways to come up with some sort of, sampling that you could figure out, any indication of whether there is a significant population that might be deceased. Again, depending upon the age of the product, and because we are talking about newer things, there may be less of a concern of any sort of buildup of ABLE accounts or 529 accounts that were taken out, a long time ago, and the owner has died, or the person for whom its benefit was opened has died. But again, these are just thoughts off the top of my head, and I'd be happy to talk off after this with anybody further about it.
Sure. And I believe one of your colleagues did say that the cost is $7,500 a year for full electronic access and updates. Is that about right, that you guys know about?
Well, I think that might have been me. I don't know. I was giving a general, the DMF from NTIS is somewhere in that range, to get the access to the historic and then the updates, but I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Well, sure. We do have a request from a fellow member of the association, would like a listing of the 31 states that have passed NCOIL. Maybe you and I can talk about that and see if we can come up with that list.
Sure, we can get that.
Well, I'd like to thank you for all that you do for the association, as well as Veris. And Jeremy, I'll turn it back over to you. We're a little bit over time. Well, this is David. I hope, Charles, are we still there?
Yep, I am
all
here.
Right. Well, I think that we've. Do you guys have any final comments before we end the webinar today?
No, I don't think so. Again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out, and I am available if anybody wants to talk to me separately after this and answer any questions that you might have thought of later, or go into any more details about anything that I discussed.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank everyone on your staff. And on behalf of NALTA and the National Association of State Treasurers, we greatly appreciate everyone's attendance today. So thanks a lot, and have a good rest of the afternoon.
All right. Thank you, David, very much. Appreciate the opportunity to present here today.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.